It was a calm and ordinary Friday night, nothing that distinguished it from any other night. I had just finished a long shift at work, exhausted by the heavy hours, dragging my feet slowly as I made my way home. The moment I walked through the door, I felt an overwhelming desire for rest. I set my bag aside and headed straight to the kitchen, where I prepared a quick meal in the microwave. The aroma of the hot food filled the room, but it did little to ease the deep fatigue creeping into my bones. I sat on the couch for a moment, leaning back, then decided to join my friends online, seeking a bit of entertainment to revive my energy. I turned on the computer, sat down, and put on my headset to start gaming with them. I had brought an energy drink and some snacks, ready to stay up late. Laughter and shouting filled the microphone, and the game completely absorbed my attention to the point where I lost track of time. My mind was entirely focused on the challenge at hand, oblivious to how much time had passed, until I suddenly heard a knock at the door. The sound was sharp and clear, cutting through the chaos of the game and forcing me to pay attention. I asked my friends to hold on for a moment, removed my headset, and slowly stood up, feeling a creeping sense of unease. As I turned away from my desk, I noticed how dark it was. The darkness consumed everything, both inside and out, with only the faint glow from the computer screen illuminating the room. A sense of discomfort washed over me. Who could be knocking at my door this late at night? I moved toward the door cautiously, my steps slow and deliberate. But before I reached it, something strange caught my eye. A man was standing outside the window, staring directly at me. I froze in place, a chill running down my spine as my heart began to race. His gaze was unsettling, locking me in place, as though his eyes alone had the power to hold me still. I tried to collect myself, but then he suddenly yelled through the glass, asking me something I couldn't comprehend in my shock. I barely managed to respond. What? As I inched closer to the window to hear him better. He repeated his question, asking if I was someone he knew named Jack or Jake, but that name wasn't mine. I shook my head silently, and without another word, he turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving me shaken and confused. I quickly closed the curtains and returned to my desk, telling my friends what had just happened. At first, they didn't believe me, but they must have heard the tremor in my voice because they began asking lots of questions. Each question heightened my anxiety, and I followed their advice, checking the doors and windows to ensure they were locked, something I rarely bothered to do. Time passed, and I began to feel as though the incident was over, just a fleeting, unsettling encounter. But suddenly, another knock rang out, this time louder and more forceful, making my body jolt. The sound came unmistakably from the front door. I whispered to my friends, letting them know what was happening. They urged me to check who it was and call the police. Quietly, I crept toward the door, peering through the small gaps in the curtains. It was the same man, standing there eerily calm, looking around as if he were waiting for something or someone. I backed away slowly and called the police, speaking to them quietly about what was happening. Another knock followed as I was on the phone. I glanced out again and saw him still there, but he was looking to his side as if communicating with someone unseen. Then, to my horror, I heard soft footsteps circling the house, stopping at one of the windows. I strained to see through the darkness and noticed the glass shift slightly, as though someone was trying to open it, but the lock held and the window fell shut again. Suddenly, a loud sound echoed, like something being forced into the window frame. The entire frame trembled, and I stood there paralyzed, unsure of what to do. Then, rapid footsteps rushed from the front door to the window before all went silent again. Just moments later, I saw the flashing red and blue lights of the police illuminating the darkness through the windows. When the police arrived, there wasn't much they could do. I provided a detailed description of the man, but it wasn't enough. It has been an entire year since that terrifying night, and they haven't returned. Yet, every detail remains vivid in my memory as if it happened just yesterday. On a quiet evening 5 years ago, I was living a simple life in a small one-bedroom apartment. The apartment was cramped, but I loved it and had grown fond of its coziness. At that time, my parents had just purchased a new house in the countryside, about an hour away from the city where I lived. The house was enormous, almost like a mansion, surrounded by vast open fields. Moving wasn't easy for them due to their demanding work schedules, so they decided to ship all their furniture and belongings to the new house a week before they could move in. Wanting to help, I offered to stay at the house temporarily to ensure everything was in order. I arrived at the grand house early on a Saturday morning, greeted the movers with a smile, and directed them to bring in the furniture. They worked for hours and finally finished by sunset. The furniture and boxes were stacked in the corners of the rooms, and only a single couch had been set up in the living room, as if it was waiting just for me. Seeing the scattered furniture really made me realize how vast the house was. The rooms seemed endless, with long, empty hallways that stretched into silence, giving the house an eerie and desolate atmosphere. After finishing some leftover dinner I had brought with me, I decided to explore the backyard. There was a spacious patio with a built-in fire pit, along with scattered outdoor furniture lining the sides. I grabbed a small chair, placed it by the fire pit, lit a fire, and sat back to enjoy the quiet night. The cool breeze brushed against my face, and the sky was clear, adding to the serene yet strangely unsettling calmness of the night. I sat there for over an hour, soaking in the tranquility, when suddenly, out of nowhere, a man appeared in the distant field. He was walking slowly across the vast, open expanse. I watched him curiously, unable to figure out where he had come from, as there was nothing but endless land as far as the eye could see. I looked in the direction he was heading, but there was nothing there either, only thick fog. He continued walking until the mist swallowed him completely, leaving behind a lingering sense of unease in my chest. I couldn't shake the strange feeling I had, but I forced myself to stay seated, watching the fog and thinking about the mysterious man. Minutes passed, and then, suddenly, he reappeared. This time, he was walking in the opposite direction, retracing his steps. He was closer now, close enough that it made me uncomfortable. I decided it was best to head back inside. Once inside, I locked the door behind me and sat on the couch, trying to calm myself down. But I kept glancing out the windows every few minutes, not wanting to be caught off guard. Around 12:30, exhaustion began to set in. I grabbed a blanket from one of the boxes, threw it over myself, and stretched out on the couch in the middle of the living room, eventually drifting off to sleep. I awoke suddenly, not knowing why. A strange, uneasy feeling enveloped the room, as though something was terribly wrong. I opened my eyes slowly, trying to adjust to the darkness. The house was completely silent, and the shadows cast by the piled boxes gave the room a distorted, menacing look. Just as I was trying to make sense of it, a bright light suddenly flooded the room. I squeezed my eyes shut against the glare, which moved around slowly before disappearing just as quickly. When I opened my eyes again, I saw another faint glare outside the front window. The beam of light moved erratically, and then, without warning, it pierced through the window, illuminating the entire living room and blinding me with its intensity. I tried to focus, but by the time my eyes adjusted, the light was gone. I approached the window cautiously, phone in hand, trying to see who might be outside. But there was nothing, only the thick fog consuming the night. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted. My best guess is that they had seen the movers earlier and assumed the house was empty, possibly planning to rob it. Whatever their intentions, I believe I was lucky. If I hadn't woken up when I did, I might have had to confront their true intentions in a far more terrifying way. One day last year, I was living in a small house in a quiet neighborhood, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. As winter began, the cold weather arrived, but what I hadn't anticipated was the storm that would unexpectedly hit the city. The sky grew thick with dark clouds, and as time passed, the wind began to howl through the trees, and the rain poured down heavily, making me feel as though the earth would be drowned under the weight of this natural flood. Unfortunately, this storm turned out to be far worse than I had expected. It struck the city with full force, trapping us inside our homes for more than 24 hours. The day was filled with chaos. Even though I was alone at home, I kept checking the news on my phone to stay updated on what was happening outside. The reports were coming in fast, talking about flooding that had submerged roads and homes, and the news broadcasted stories of strong winds that were tearing trees from the ground, shattering windows, and ripping roofs off buildings. The situation was getting worse, and many people were in a state of panic. I sat there, trapped in my home, feeling isolated, listening to the storm that was roaring outside. I watched the television, continuously following the news updates, my eyes watching the clock as it hit 5 o'clock in the evening. At that moment, the electricity started to flicker, going off and on intermittently every few minutes, going dark for a few seconds before coming back, only to go out again. This continued for the first hour. Initially, I thought the problem was minor and that the power would come back soon, but after a while, a strange feeling began to creep into my chest. I realized that the storm might be worse than just bad weather. The power outages continued, and eventually, it was cut off completely. I sat there in total darkness, waiting for the lights to return, but I gradually realized that they wouldn't come back until the storm passed. I put my phone aside and sat in the living room, thinking about the situation, while checking the news once more via my mobile data. I had little choice but to stay still inside the house, watching through the windows at the dark skies and the unrelenting rain. The atmosphere outside was bleak, but fortunately, I felt safe within my home. Suddenly, in the midst of the stillness, I heard a loud knocking on the front door. The sound was deep and forceful, as if someone were knocking violently. The noise startled me, and it felt entirely out of place amid the raging storm. The winds were howling outside, and the rain was pouring like a waterfall. How could anyone be out there in this harsh weather? I felt a wave of unease and hesitated for a moment before moving. But after a brief moment of thought, I decided to check the situation. Perhaps one of my neighbors needed something, or maybe it was someone passing by who needed help due to the storm. Despite how strange it seemed, I cautiously approached the door and peered through the peephole, but I saw no one. The storm was still raging outside, but the feeling of discomfort only grew within me. Perhaps I had been too late to check, and whoever it was had disappeared quickly. I returned to the living room and decided to open a small window to allow a bit of light from the outside to come in. The darkness had begun to settle over the room, and there was no other way to light the space except for the occasional moonlight peeking through the clouds. A growing sense of anxiety crept over me as I was alone in this quiet house, and with no power, the isolation felt even more intense, stirring up strange emotions. At that moment, I felt something odd blending with the sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside. I thought it might just be the wind or my imagination, but suddenly I heard the sound again. It was faint but clear, as if someone was speaking to another person outside. I spun around quickly, thinking that perhaps I had imagined the sound, but when I looked back through the window, the sky was still very dark, and the rain was falling heavily. Yet, I noticed something strange. In a brief flash of lightning, I saw a figure standing near the edge of the yard, among the dark trees. I couldn't make out any details or understand what they were doing, but there they were, standing in the darkness. The figure quickly disappeared as the darkness returned to engulf everything, and I felt an increasing sense of tension in my chest. There was someone outside my house in this storm. I shut the windows quickly and went upstairs to the bedroom, unable to stop thinking about the mysterious person I had seen. The question that kept swirling in my mind was, who were they? And why were they standing out there in the middle of the storm? Hours passed as I sat in the dark, listening only to the storm and the howling winds outside. Nothing else happened, but I could feel my anxiety growing. At that moment, I suddenly heard a faint sound coming from downstairs. It sounded like a door opening. My heart began to race, and I froze, unable to move. I tried to listen, but the storm's noise had grown louder, making it impossible to hear anything else. I sat in the dark, the anxiety growing within me. Was it the same person I had seen earlier? And what did they want from me? Minutes passed, and then I called emergency services. I knew that the police wouldn't be able to get there quickly because of the storm, but I needed to inform them about what was happening. At that point, more than 30 minutes passed before the police arrived. During that time, I didn't hear any other sounds. There was no movement in the house, as if everyone had vanished. When the police arrived, they found the front door open, with wet footprints on the floor, but there was no evidence of a break-in or any malicious intent. It seemed as though the person had entered the house, wandered around for a few minutes, and then left without any clear reason. To this day, I still haven't been able to figure out who that person was or what they were doing that strange night.